We often have bright, young, and sometimes not so young, experts in the comments, telling us that our wonderful secular scientists know just about everything. And they always tell us the truth. Whereas poor deluded creationists have got it all wrong. But there are some very well-known scientists who are not quite so sure about that. Gregory Chaitin started publishing papers when he was a teenager. He'd become expert at searching out the latest research and mastering much of the disciplines of maths and physics before entering a university. So he didn't waste his time doing so. Instead, he produced software for IBM while he did his exciting research in his own time. Kurt Jaimungal interviews notable scientists in his Theories of Everything program.
I'm disappointed. I had hoped for more exciting developments in my lifetime. The fundamental theory of physics is still quantum mechanics from a century ago. It is now, I think, pretty close to a century. And I find that disappointing. I think that nature's imagination is probably greater than our imagination. I think there are sociology of science reasons that fundamental innovation is not going at the same pace that it did. So I'm disappointed. And why is this happening? Well, I think part of the reason is there's too much bureaucracy now controlling what researchers do. They're not being allowed to do good curiosity-based research. They're sort of machines into making money, getting research grants for their university. And I can give some examples of this. I was at a meeting in Arizona once having a beer with Lenny Susskind, and he said he was disappointed with the young students. He said when he was a student, he and his fellow graduate students, didn't pay attention to their professor, and they wanted to break the system, discover new things, create a whole new world. And he said the graduate students he gets now want to do a PhD with him, ask him to give them a research topic. They don't have their own challenging ideas. They ask him to give them a research topic. And then they proceed to grind out paper after paper, small incremental little things for the rest of their career on that topic. And there's a reason, of course, because if you hesitate to learn a new topic or to get involved in a new area, the publish or perish problem that you have to have a steady stream of sausages coming out of the machine. Oh, there's another part of this. This business of the dean can count, but the dean can't read. You're measured only by the number of papers you publish. The quality of the papers is irrelevant, right? I think everyone knows the system is deeply flawed. Nobody knows how to change it, but I'm hoping there will be a rebirth, a renaissance with more innovation and more new fundamental ideas someday.
Can you tell me what's meant by the current system? Because when people hear that and they think, well, there are thousands of universities and it's not as if they're in collusion with one another. There are different countries, there are different laws. How could a system have been developed in order to even call that system the system?
Well, there is a system. To be accredited, a university grants degrees. For these degrees to be recognized, the university has to be accredited by international accrediting institutions. And there are all kinds of rules and regulations so that you count. And so there is actually tremendous pressure to conform and to do things at your university like everyone else does. Otherwise, you're in trouble. There are, 30 or 40 institutes for advanced study in the world. And there are rules, and you have to follow those rules. Who would have guessed? Don't know whether would admire or the pity the young people who decide to go into science in universities nowadays. I certainly wouldn't do it. There are good periods and bad periods as far as creativity and innovation are concerned. We have a good period for technological innovation, but not for fundamental science. There's also the fact that new ideas will be rejected by referees in general. There's a joke that it's better to be wrong with the majority than to be right on your own. I think that's certainly the case in the world of science, where new ideas are treated viciously. If you extrapolate from the history of science, every period has thought that they had sort of final knowledge. They couldn't imagine anything else, of course. But every so many years, there was a paradigm shift. And I'm disappointed that there hasn't been one in the past century. And I suspect it's because the current system doesn't let people come up with a paradigm shift. And if they did, they would never be able to get it published. Let me start with my friend Stephen Wolfram. He's not working in a university environment. What he did was to create a company, and he's self-funding his research. I wouldn't have been able to get grants for the research I was doing. And Stephen Wolfram made his own company to fund his own research. You have to be very good to pull that off. But he of course, has done it brilliantly.
We met another well-known scientist with a burning desire to pursue his research topic in episode 74. Eric Lerner also had to start his own company to do research, and he also raised crowdfunding support. The establishment wouldn't fund his work because it went against the current paradigm.
Another fact is that the best age for fundamental innovation is when you're in high school, because afterwards you start being brainwashed. Stephen and I were chatting to each other about that. Afterwards, if you continue on to the university, you start being brainwashed with the current, the current fashions, the current paradigms.
Right.
And so if you want to come up with really innovative ideas that can go off in new directions, if you don't have them in high school, I mean, Stephen has a summer camp for high school students where he feels it's the last age at which he can really influence people, because afterwards they get caught in the system.
Chaitin points out that Einstein would also have been rejected by the current system.
That's another example of somebody outside the system, a rebel, an unconventional person. And the miracle is that his paper, nowadays nobody would publish papers from somebody like that, even if they were wonderful, especially if they were wonderful, because the referees would say, this is nonsense, I don't believe this. Another problem is that experiments which are not in accordance with existing theory are rejected. You can't publish them. Now, those are precisely the experiments that could lead to new physics.
And finally, he points out why innovation in science has died.
Where you publish papers that a group of people will approve of, the referees. And, having a committee decide something is a very bad idea. As somebody once said, the intelligence of a committee is the intelligence of the stupidest member of the committee, because you have to make compromises in order for the committee to come to a decision.
Chaitin was very calm, telling us about his disappointment with the state of science. But let's look at someone we know very well, who doesn't manage to remain so calm in her disappointment.
For decades, there have been two different schools of thought in the field of loop quantum gravity, one of which, represented most prominently by Lee Smolin, has insisted that the theory can be tested with upcoming experiments. The other, represented by Carlo Rovelli, is fine with the theory being untestable for practical purposes. So now the situation is that either the theory is falsified or it's not falsifiable. It's exactly the same crap as with string theory and supersymmetry and inflation and dark sectors and many other research bubbles in the foundations of physics. It's mathematical fiction. It's nothing to do with reality anymore. I don't understand why people get paid for doing this. And I say this as someone who once got paid for doing this. I can't believe that this is still going on. I recently heard Eric Weinstein say in a video that we're seeing the beginning of a collapse in the foundations of physics because it's so obvious now that string theory was a huge mistake. I think you're wrong, Eric. This will keep on going and going until physics is entirely dead. What we're seeing now is just that the senior people are handing over to their students. You see, the issue is that in loop quantum gravity, areas of space become quantized. They take on discrete values. There's the smallest possible area that you can have, which is proportional to the square of the Planck length, and the Planck length is something like 10 to the minus 35 meters. Now, what I said in my previous video is that a minimal area isn't compatible with Lorentz invariance. It just isn't, because length contraction should make that minimal gravitational area smaller than minimal. Proof by contradiction, Maths 101. Q. Carlo, who says that if you quantize the angular momentum operator, then the spectrum of eigenvalues is discrete, and that doesn't violate rotational invariance, and it works similarly in loop quantum gravity with Lorentz invariance. I tried to tell them long ago that this can't work because these deviations would inevitably be so large we'd have seen them already. They didn't want to hear that. There are still people writing papers about this nonsense. I just decided at some point that if I can't stop others from wasting time and money, at least I myself can stop wasting time and money. So I've tried really hard to ignore this. But it's so frustrating to see that this is still going on. They're still discussing the same nonsense as 20 years ago. Everyone who works on this just repeats arguments that they all know to be wrong to keep the money coming. Because let's be real, these people sit on cozy tax-paid positions with no other task than producing useless papers that no one understands and therefore no one dares criticize. But the fact is, this so-called research has been going on for 4 decades, and what's come out of it besides papers? Nothing. Nada. Niente. It hasn't taught us anything about nature whatsoever. If you look at the archive and check what people in loop quantum gravity work on these days, it's basically still the same stuff they did 20 years ago. History repeating. No self-correction, no progress. And it's like that in string theory too. They're now going back to, inventing some string theory phenomenology, something with moduli and inflation and dark sectors and whatnot. And they'll claim they can test it and someone will measure something and it'll be falsified. How do I know that this will be falsified? Because this isn't how science works. It's never worked that way. I don't know how it ever became accepted that inventing some maths and insisting it's real counts as theoretical physics. It's insane.
Well, not many scientists are prepared to tell it like it is quite as frankly as our heroine Sabina does. She mentions Eric Weinstein, who we also met in episode 74. He also has something to say about it.
Is this too far gone for string theory now? Is it the mask is beginning to slip to the point where even Ed Dutton's going to have to eat his words within the next decade?
They'll never eat their words. They'll just keep lying. Lying is a way of life. Lying to the public. Science is fine. What we have now learned to call the science TM is an abomination. And you have to hunt out the science TM, which lives inside of the journals, lives inside of the funding agencies, lives inside of the departmental defense mechanisms, lives inside of the CIA, DITRA, all of these sorts of blob-related agencies that get their paws into science.
Is this indicative of a broader problem in all of science? Is physics the tip of the spear, or is there anything even further down?
Science used to be dominated by physics and mathematics. Then it became biology focused. So right now, when you say science, most people think biology, rather than in previous years where most people thought the physicists who could do everything. We need hearings. And we need to basically rid the National Academy of Sciences, the National Science Foundation, the National Science Board, the National Research Council, the journals, Lancet, Nature, Science, publishing houses of all of the science. We've got to get rid of the science. The science is infecting us. I think we could make fantastic progress within theoretical physics within 5 years. And I can promise you nobody's interested in funding it. There's an entire community of trolls hunting people who dissent. Like, I bet Sabine Hassenfelder has people who are just sitting around trying to destroy her.
Yeah.
Why don't we find out whether somebody has something to say? Instead, what it is that there's this constant sort of whisper campaign against somebody like Sabine. Oh, she's a popularizer. She's not serious. She doesn't know her stuff, blah, 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 blah.
I really like his suggestion Get rid of the secular scientific establishment's corrupt, disastrous science with a capital S, and get back to real science. But he knows perfectly well that, desirable though that may be, it would take a miracle to have it happen. The depth of the pit, which science with a capital S, science falsely so called, has got itself into is now so deep that most scientists can't even bring themselves to admit that Robitaille and Carruthers are obviously right about the disastrous state of astronomy.
If one examines many of the common equations in astrophysics, one will find that they violate the laws of thermodynamics. Our attempts to achieve sustainable fusion on Earth using the ITER reactor in France is a case in point. ITER is built on the belief that we can achieve fusion based on our understanding that such processes take place in a gaseous sun. Yes, the stars are powered by fusion, but the problem is that the sun and the stars are not gaseous in nature, and this has consequences. One can see that all the key expressions predicting nuclear reactions in gaseous stars are thermodynamically invalid. The only reasonable solution to this dilemma is to recognize, as I have repeatedly stated, that the stars are comprised of condensed matter, and nuclear reactions within stars must take advantage of lattice confinement fusion, as I first advanced in this paper and discussed in these videos. As for the ITER facility, it will be unable to produce any usable energy. Therefore, it was not reasonable to assume that any appreciable fusion would ever come from trying to confine a gaseous plasma. The answer for fusion must rest in condensed matter physics. Condensed matter physicists must have the courage to stand up for their own discipline and to counter such unreasonable claims as gaseous stars, big bangs, and black holes.
And one of the UK's most famous biotechnology experts, who we met in episode 106, continues to demolish current biology with ever more embarrassing truths about evolution.
The cell replicates the DNA. It's an active process by the living cell. It's a little bit right to say it replicates like a crystal because, as we all know, the DNA is wound around itself in a double helix. So if you unravel the double helix, which is what you have to do in order to read the genome, when we make our proteins, that's what we have to do. So if you unravel it, it's natural for one nucleotide to attract its pair and for the other one to attract its pair. That process is quite good. It's accurate to about 1 in 10,000 base pairs. The bases are the nucleotides, of course. We have got 3 billion base pairs. Just do the maths quite quickly. You've got many hundreds of thousands of errors by that process alone. Those 1 in 10,000 errors, which would produce hundreds of thousands in a full genome of 3 billion, get corrected by literally an army. It's at least a dozen little proteins that come in and walk along the genome and find these errors. They then coordinate to correct it. The cell itself is important to have all the processes that enable that correcting process. We actually call it the proof correcting process in DNA replication. So a complete cell can produce an almost complete copy of the DNA from that cell. It's extraordinary. If Schrödinger had been told that in 1942, your process would lead to hundreds of thousands of errors occurring in the genetic material when it was copied, he wouldn't believe it. That was worked out much later in the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s. But we now know the complexity of that process.
And the complexity of that process demands that the cell be fully functional before DNA can be of any use at all, and that wipes the last shred of credibility for the popular story of little by little evolution of life from non-life and its subsequent little by little evolution from the simplest bacterium to higher life forms. I will praise thee, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Marvellous are thy works, and this my soul knoweth right well. Thine eyes did see my substance, yet being unperfect, and in thy book all my members were written, which in continuance were fashioned, when as yet there was none of them. Thank you for joining me for this episode. If you enjoyed it, please like, subscribe and press the bell so that you'll be notified as I release new movies. If you'd like to support this project, you're welcome to do so through Patreon. Find a link on my channel banner and in the description below.